Hi there, everybody. Welcome to day one of Illustrator Essentials. I'm Sam. I'll be your guide through the 6 days of this course. In 6 sessions, we're going to cover all the basics of Adobe Illustrator. As with all other Adobe programs, Illustrator is really powerful and complex. You'll never know everything, but we will cover enough of the basics and a wide variety of things, so you should end up with a pretty solid foundation. Today, we're going to start from the very beginning. So if you've never opened Illustrator before, this is for you. If you already have some experience with Illustrator, you might want to speed up this video or skip ahead to video 2. I guess let's get started. We have some practice files that you can download. These are accessible at files.learnsoftware.org. If you just go to this URL, then go to Illustrator, we're just going to download the day 1 practice files. And then I'll unzip those. If you're working on a PC, you do have to make sure that you go in and extract the files. Let's start out by talking about what Illustrator is for. So you'll see there's an image in here with a little bit of an example that says pixels versus vectors. Illustrator is a program that works with vector graphics, which if you've never heard that term before, that's fine, but you'll be very familiar with it by the end of this course. If you've worked with other images before, you've probably been working with raster graphics, like this here on the left. So in raster images, which is what you'd be working with in, say, Adobe Photoshop or Lightroom, just a camera, that's all going to be raster images, which basically the image is created by a computer being told which color each pixel is supposed to be. So you have a number of pixels at each point, and if you zoom in, then you can actually see the individual pixels, and it's like this square is this color, and then this square is a different color. And as you zoom out, you see the whole picture created by those subtle differences. A vector graphic is different. Vector graphics are based on shapes. So these complete objects, which are mathematically defined. So, a rectangle, instead of being a set of pixels in a certain area, is just 4 points with lines between them and a color on the inside. So drawing with vectors is going to be a little bit different from what you might be used to if you're used to photo editing and things like that. But it has some benefits. You use vectors a lot of the time where you want to be able to scale this up to any size. Because the benefit of these being mathematically defined is that they're going to have a crisp edge at any size. You could put the same image on a business card or a billboard, and it would have the same quality without being a huge image file. Everything's going to be a little bit flatter, more cartoonish, because it just doesn't have, the subtle grades of color that you get in the real world or in other types of pixel-based art. I just have a Google search here to show some examples of different kinds of things people do in Adobe Illustrator. You might use it to create logos or characters, graphic design things, scenes, and people get into some really complicated stuff. Typography, some document layout, web mock-ups. So if you're interested in those things, then you're in the right place. And hopefully this will be really useful for you. Okay, so let's open up Illustrator, create a new file. So I'm just going to hit Create New here, or you could also go up to the menus and select File, New. And you'll see this New File menu. If you've been working in Illustrator recently, you'll have a set of file sizes and defaults here from things that you've done recently. But otherwise, you need to go to these tabs up at the top and select maybe Web or Print for the type of work that you're going to be doing. It doesn't really matter right now because all we're doing is creating some sort of gibberish. So I'll just use a print default. And these are just different sizes. Of course, you can always customize everything over on the right. You have the settings for the, the size and shape of things. Hit Create. And we just want to have a document here where we can work on some stuff. The first thing that we're going to talk about is using the shape tools. So if you're familiar with other Adobe programs, this interface should be pretty familiar. You have tools over on the left, and then more options in the options bar at the top and on the right. If you're working in an older version of Illustrator, you might have more options at the top as well. But they've recently moved a lot of that into the properties panel, which is usually on the right. So Anyway, I'll just select the rectangle tool, which is just this little rectangle, or you can use the keyboard shortcut M if you want to jump to it on your keyboard. And then to draw a rectangle, basically all you do is just click and drag over the area where you want it to be. It's going to be, pretty straightforward. And anywhere that you click with this tool will draw a rectangle. If you want to move your rectangles or resize them or do any other adjustment type stuff, you'll need to switch to the selection tool, which is the black arrow at the top of the toolbar. Like for instance, if I just drew this extra rectangle and I want to delete it, I'll select it with the selection tool and hit the delete key on my keyboard. Or if I wanted to select one of these and change its color, I would select it with the selection tool, not the rectangle tool. And then color options are down here at the bottom left in the toolbar. I would just double click on that to change the fill color or the stroke color, which is the outline. Yeah, and that pulled up a panel as well, which I don't need. So some other options with these shape tools. If you want to draw a perfect square, you can just be careful and it will kind of snap to a perfect square. But if you hold the Shift key on your keyboard, that will constrain it to make sure that it always stays perfect. And then the Option key, or Alt if you're on a Mac, will let you draw shapes out from the center instead of drawing from a corner. You can also use the space bar if you're in the middle of drawing a shape and you want to move it to somewhere else. So I'd be drawing a shape and then I can move it over here by holding spacebar, and then I release spacebar to keep drawing if for some reason that was important to you. And there's a bunch of shape tools here in this group that all work pretty similarly. So if you see this little white arrow in the corner of the tool, that means this tool is in a group of similar tools. So I can right click or click and hold on this to pull out that sort of drawer of tools in my toolbox. And I could switch to a different tool. The ellipse tool, for instance, works almost exactly the same as the rectangle tool. It just draws ellipses instead of rectangles, or if you add Shift, then it will draw circles instead of squares. The only difference here is with the ellipse tool, you can also use the control key, or sorry, the command key, if you want to draw from a point actually on the circle instead of drawing from a point on a sort of imaginary square surrounding it. But I usually don't bother with that. Then the rounded rectangle tool is also pretty similar. It just has one difference, and that's rounded corners. So this gives you some extra options. If you want to control how rounded the corners are, you just use your arrow keys. While you're drawing a shape, you hit the up arrow to increase the roundedness, or the down arrow to decrease the roundedness. And you might want to hold those down for a little while for it to actually make a big difference if you're working on a large file especially. So that's really nice if you're doing like a web mockup or something and you want a rounded edged button or something like that. You use the rounded rectangle tool, and that's a lot easier than trying to combine a bunch of circles and rectangles to get the shape you want. And you can adjust the roundedness of those corners as well after the fact, just by clicking on these little circle handles near each corner with the rectangle tool or with the selection tool. Then the other two shape tools we're going to talk about are the polygon and star tools. The flare tool is not really useful, so we'll just ignore it. But the polygon tool will draw shapes with any number of sides. They're always going to be regular shapes, so if you're trying to create something more interesting, then you might need to use some of the tools we'll talk about in later days of this class, or create a basic shape and then edit it. But if you wanted to create, say, an octagon, then you'd use the polygon tool for that. And to adjust the number of sides, you use the arrow keys up and down. So for an octagon, I need 8. Shift will snap it into place so that the bottom side of the shape is perfectly horizontal. The star tool works almost exactly the same as the polygon tool. You use up and down to control the number of points on the star. One extra thing you can do with the star tool as well is if you hold Command or Control if you're on a PC, then when you pull out from the center or move in towards the center, instead of adjusting the whole shape, it just adjusts the points. So I hold Command and then pull out from the center to make it a really pointy star. Or if I was drawing and it's too pointy, I hold Command and go in towards the center, and then I could release Command and use that shape instead. And the last thing with these shape tools, with every one of these tools, you can click and drag to create a shape, or if you just click instead, then it will pull up a menu where you can set the specific values for your shape. So for instance, on the star tool, it asks me, how big do I want the radii to be towards the inside of the star and the outside of the star? How many points does it have? If I was drawing a rectangle, this would just have the width and height settings, and this will default to just following the settings of whatever you drew most recently. So if you're trying to create an exact duplicate of something that you just made, then it can be convenient to just click, and then it defaults to those settings and you hit OK. And then once you've created all of these shapes, we want to talk about some basic tools that you can use to manipulate the things that you've made. So I'm going to switch to the selection tool, the black arrow up at the top of the keyboard. And the selection tool is going to give us access to a lot of the basic settings. This is sort of your home base tool where you'll go when you don't want to be doing something else that's more specific, but you just want to do normal things to a shape. So with the selection tool, you can click on any shape and you'll get these resize handles on the bounding box. If you hold Shift while you're stretching, then it will make sure you keep the same proportions that you originally had. So that's really important if you're working with stars or polygons or perfect squares and circles, things that you want to keep the same shape. You just need it at a different size. Make sure you hold Shift when you resize. Delete objects just by selecting them and then hitting the delete key on your keyboard. Or as we talked about earlier, you can change a bunch of settings for the object as long as you have it selected. So you have some basic settings over here on the left in your toolbar. You have the fill color and stroke color. The fill is the inside of the shape, and then the stroke is its outline. You also have a lot more options similar to that in the Properties panel. So the Properties panel should be open on your right. If you're not seeing it there, the Window menu is where you have a list of all available panels, and you can just find Properties on that list, and then that will pull it up. But in the Properties panel, you have the option to set, you can set the fill color or the stroke color. You'll notice if you're using this menu to set fill and stroke colors, it gives you these preset colors instead of defaulting to like a full color picker, like you get the full color picker when you double click in the toolbar. So that's just slightly different interface. You also have the option to set the stroke weight, which is how thick the stroke is, and opacity, which you won't use all the time, but when you do need it, it's nice. That just lets you make an object partially transparent. And you can do a lot of other things here, setting the size of the rectangle, or if you wanted to add effects or other, actions and things. The Properties panel is going to be really useful when we come back to it for other things, but basically it should just adapt based on whatever you have selected to give you the relevant options for that thing. So this is a really simple rectangle, so our Properties panel is quite simple as well. But if we had, for instance, a group of objects selected, we would get different choices in the Properties panel for how to handle them. And you have these dotted menus as well if you want more options related to the options that you're seeing. Or some of these words as well will open up mini panels. Like if I wanted more stroke options, like I wanted to make it a dotted line or round the corners on the stroke or something like that. Those are in stroke options. The Layers panel is also going to be super useful because the Layers panel is where you go to organize your file. So right now everything is in layer 1, so I need to hit this little arrow to unstack that and see the details. I have all these different objects on layer 1, and they defaulted to being in the order in which I created them. So the things that I drew first are on the bottom. But if I wanted this rectangle to be on top of all the other objects, I just need to click and drag it to the top of the Layers panel. And now it shows up in front of the other objects. You can also use the layers panel to temporarily hide objects, which is nice if you don't want to delete something, but you just don't want to worry about it right now. You just come here and hide it, bring it back later. That's totally non-destructive. Or you can also, right next to those eyes, you can toggle on locking of objects or whole layers as well. So those locks will make it so that these objects are unselectable. You can also do that rearranging. If you don't want to click and drag in the layers panel every time, select it and then right click, and you get this arrange menu where you can say send it to the back or just send it backward one step in the layer stack. Okay, then the direct selection tool is going to be just next to the selection tool. It's the white one, or if you're using keyboard shortcuts, selection tool is V and the direct selection tool is A, the two pointy letters that look like arrows. So the direct selection tool is, instead of selecting whole objects, this will let you select the individual points that an object is made from. So if I select this shape, I can see these 4 points show up. And if I click on one of them, the other ones become hollow. That means this point alone is selected and the rest aren't. So now I can click and drag and I can move this point to reshape my object. So for instance, if I wanted to make just one point of this star pointier, I select it with my direct selection tool by just clicking on that point, and then I click and drag to move it to somewhere else. And anywhere that you have curved shapes, you'll get extra points that pop up. When I select one of these anchor points, these handles pop up next to it, and that's how Illustrator handles curves. Whenever there's curved lines, they're defined mathematically by these anchor points and handles. And the length of the handle will determine like how strongly the curve goes that direction. And then the direction of the handle is what direction is the line going when it comes out of that anchor. So the combination of these 2 anchor points and these 2 handles determines this portion of the line, how it will be shaped. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail on some other days of the class when we talk about things like the pen tool. But right now, all you need to know is just use the direct selection tool when you want to edit individual anchor points on a shape, and use the regular selection tool when you want to edit whole objects. So if I wanted to just move this or resize it. And if you want to select multiple things with either of those tools, you hold Shift. So I have this object selected, I can hold Shift and click to select all of these objects and move them together or resize them together. And the same thing works with the direct selection tool. If I want to move this anchor point and this anchor point, then I select them both with Shift, and then I can move them down here. You can also click and drag to draw boxes to select multiple things. So I just drew this box from here to here, and it selected all 4 anchor points in that space so that I could move them down and extend this rectangle a little bit. Or with the regular selection tool, drawing a box will just select every object that the box touches. Now, if you want some more practice on a more sort of directed project, in those class files that you downloaded, there's this file called icons.ai. That's an Adobe Illustrator document. If you open that up, it'll open in Illustrator. Might take a moment. There we go. And this file is going to have a series of icons that are created based on simple shapes. So we'll talk in the next video about how you can combine these shapes to create more complicated things. But for now, you should take this challenge, use the shape tools however you think is best to create all of the shapes that you would need if you were trying to build some of these icons. Simple shapes seem like very, very basic things, but they actually are very useful, and you can build, as you can see here, a lot of really complex and really useful art just from simple things. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you on day 2.